This is a Squiz podcast. We're your shortcut to being informed.
The weekly wrap is the week in news and what's coming up. I'm Claire Kimball.
And I'm Jodie Spears.
We're starting off this week with a look at what's gone down at the United Nations. There's so many tangents that news story this week, but we're going to pull the key things together and try and make sense of it for you.
Yeah, we'll also cover off Optus's latest troubles and why Tylenol has been a key search term this week.
There's also a tie-up between Australia's most powerful and Labubu's. We'll get into that.
I'm intrigued.
As you're starting your weekend, I'm wondering if you popped a load of washing on.
Always.
What I do first thing on a Saturday morning. There's been a new choice product test out this week. It's about laundry detergents, laundry detergent sheets, which I think I've come across online.
I've used them.
Have you? Okay, we'll get into that. They're kind of a new cleaning product on the block. What this choice product test found, though, they're not much better than water when it comes to stain removal.
But you don't have to drain the last bit out of the bottle, which is always annoying. So I quite like the sheets. Look, we're starting here because this was the most clicked link from the Squiz Today newsletter this week. I'm not sure what that says about us, but plenty of Squizzers were interested in this one. Choice found that while those sheets are more eco-friendly, the execution wasn't there yet. As far as regular laundry detergent goes, Choice gave some bouquets to Omo.
That's my laundry detergent of choice. I'm sure people are dying to know that. I'm of the pod variety. I gave up draining bottles a long time ago and powder that just seemed to get everywhere. So I use the little pods. Across the board, Omo and its product line comes very highly recommended. Choice also noted, though, that it doesn't come cheap.
No, it doesn't. And I've learnt that recently because I'm traditionally a Dynamo girl myself.
Okay,
However, I was told off recently by the washing machine repair guy for not using Omo in the Miele machine. Apparently that's a thing. So
Omo coming up trumps.
That's right.
Jodie, from suds to substance, we'll get into the biggest story of the week. The United Nations General Assembly in New York, it's provided plenty of headlines across the week. We're not going to go into a blow-by-blow account of every little single thing that happened, but we'll focus on some big key themes. A common thread between them, though, is that they all involve a big global threat of some sort.
Yeah, that's the link. We'll start with climate change and the fact that China has set concrete emissions reduction targets for the very first time. President Xi Jinping made this announcement on a video call to the UN Climate Summit early on Thursday morning, our time. He says that his country would cut emissions by 7 to 10% by 2035.
Yeah, what the experts say is that's not exactly an ambitious target. Experts reckon that it's well short of what's needed from the world's biggest polluter. It's a shift, though, nonetheless, to come to the table for the first time and set a target. President Xi told the conference that China would amp up its solar, its wind, its hydropower to the point where those sources would provide 30% of the nation's energy over the next decade.
Yeah, this is interesting for a few different reasons. China burns more coal than the rest of the world put together, so any changes that it makes will have a real impact on global emissions. But it's the effect on attitudes as well, which is notable. Some say that this reinvigorates action on climate change.
Yeah, and those who resist such action have long used China as an example, that they're the biggest emitter but they don't have a target, saying, oh, well, it doesn't really matter much what we do if China isn't coming to the table. And this changes that equation entirely. At the same time, though, you have the world's other superpower, the United States, moving in a very different direction.
So interesting. The US is reversing its climate policies, like you say, withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement and totally rejecting international cooperation on this front. In his very long speech at the UN this week, Donald Trump claimed that climate change is the greatest con job ever perpetrated on the world.
Yeah, no real surprises there. I think everyone was expecting that kind of tone from him, particularly on that topic. For our part, Australia has set an ambitious new target for 2035, and that was outlined at this conference. That would see us cutting emissions between 62 and 70% by that date, by 2035. It's a higher target than comparable countries like New Zealand, Canada, Japan. I don't think I'd quite clock that in the conversation over the last couple of weeks of setting that new target, that we're really quite above a lot of other nations when it comes to our ambition there. It's going to be likely within a similar range to European countries, though. They've been leaders in this space, although the European nations missed the deadline, so they haven't yet formally set those targets.
Yeah, it's sort of a similar range that they're talking about. Moving on to another major theme of the UN meetings, the security threat posed by Russia. We saw a significant change in the position of the US on the Russia-Ukraine war this week.
Yeah, so President Trump has been trying for some time to broker a ceasefire. We've talked about that a couple of times, Jodie, you and I. Donald Trump has been urging Ukraine to do a deal with Russia, suggesting that they would need to give up land, that whole entire conversation about territory and where borders might be, and, maybe even giving Russia what they currently have under control. But what Trump did is he took to social media through the week saying he now thinks that Ukraine could defeat Russia, and that could be done with NATO support. And, of course, America is a big part of NATO, and that Ukraine could get all that territory back.
Yeah, quite the shift. While the war grinds on in Ukraine, Russia has been testing the limits when it comes to some of the other European territories, which has put the whole region on high alert. There have been drone incursions into Poland and Romania in recent weeks. Russian fighter jets also entered Estonian airspace, and there were shutdowns on Monday at both Copenhagen and Oslo airports after drones were spotted. That was presenting a safety issue, so they had to stop flights for a while. Russia was suspected of being behind that as well, although there hasn't been confirmation.
Yeah, for Ukraine's part, its leader, Volodymyr Zelensky, told the United Nations General Assembly that we're living through the most destructive arms race in human history. He emphasised the need for more weapons support for them to be able to fight Russia. He said that doing that is essentially cheaper in the long run, and cheaper than wondering who will be the first to create a simple drone carrying a nuclear warhead.
Scary stuff. I listened to the Estonian foreign minister being interviewed on the ABC on Thursday, and he spoke about these efforts to collaborate on a drone wall to keep out Russian drones. This is still a bit of a new challenge for some of these defence forces because they're used to sending multi-million-dollar fighter jets up to intercept any threats in the air, but that doesn't really make sense when it comes to these small drones.
And this so-called drone wall could be built close to Russia's western border. That would involve at least 7 EU member states, so Estonia, Latvia, Finland, Lithuania, Poland, Romania and Bulgaria, and all working together with Ukraine.
Yeah, the idea is still in its early stages and it's not clear exactly how it would work, but it would involve technology to detect incoming drones and then intercept them somehow. There's growing urgency to get something like this up and running ASAP because tensions between Russia and NATO are really escalating.
And Jodie, just to wrap up our chat about what happened at the UN, there was one more threat that loomed pretty large over proceedings, and that's the one presented by social media, particularly to the lives and the well-being of young people. This is an area where Australia is leading the way, particularly with that introduction of a ban for social media on the under-16s. That's due to come into place here on the 10th of December.
Yeah, an Aussie mum called Emma Mason kind of stole the show here. She moved a room of people to tears at UN headquarters. She was telling them how her 15-year-old daughter Tilly tragically took her own life in 2022 after she was viciously bullied online. Leaders of several other countries have shown an interest in following our lead in this area, particularly after listening to her speech, and that included the European Commission boss, Ursula von der Leyen.
Yeah, so she's a mother and a grandmother, and she says that it's just common sense to try and limit kids' access to those social media apps. She said that she was inspired by Australia's move in this area and that it's an example of what determined countries can do.
Tech companies, of course, not so happy about this, and there are concerns that it could be another point of tension in our relationship with the US. The list of apps which will be part of this ban hasn't been finalised yet. They're still working on it, so that's something we'll be keeping an eye on.
Moving on to 3 other stories from the week, and let's start with Optus, particularly that 000 outage last Thursday. For about 10 hours, people in parts of South Australia, Western Australia, the Northern Territory and the border regions across to New South Wales, they couldn't call emergency services. 3 deaths have been linked to that outage.
Must have just been terrifying to be in that situation. CEO Stephen Rue fronted the media a couple of times in the week. On Wednesday, he blamed it on human error. What happened essentially was that during a routine firewall upgrade, staff didn't follow that basic process of first diverting the calls to a separate part of the network, which would have allowed them to get through.
So the big question is, why do these catastrophic things keep happening to Optus? They had a major outage, remember, in 2023, then a massive data breach, and now this. There's been a bit of analysis this week saying that probably a good starting point is to have a look at who owns Optus.
Yeah, so let's do that. Optus is wholly owned by Singtel, which is majority owned by Temasek Holdings. Temasek is fully owned by the Singaporean government. Essentially, the Singapore government has significant control over Australia's second largest telco, and some experts argue that this is part of the problem.
Yeah, in that it's about investment. So the Financial Review this week wrote about Singtel cutting its investment in Optus's mobile network by about $237 million last year, despite being under a lot of pressure to improve reliability after that 2023 network outage. And the challenge that telcos have, of course, looking at it from their side of the page, is that they've lost a lot of revenue because more of us are relying on these sort of calls made via the internet. So think about WhatsApp, for example. So they're really sort of struggling to make the numbers work when it comes to modernising their networks.
Yeah, Singtel says that it's invested heaps in Optus, but there are other cost management issues at play here as well. Most of Optus's 3,850 call centre staff are based overseas in the Philippines and in India. At 9 a.m. on Thursday, so 7 hours into this outage, 2 customers called to say that they couldn't reach 000, but those warnings weren't escalated, and Optus HQ only found out then at 1:30 in the afternoon when South Australian Emergency Services contacted them directly.
Yeah, and by then, by the time, the senior people in the organisation were alerted, that outage had been at play for 12 hours. So the question is, would Australian-based call centre staff better understood the urgency of 000 being down? There's a question about that. Optus has 250 frontline call centre staff based here in Australia. The company cut 160 jobs out of that call centre crew in 2023. So that got a lot of attention this week as well, that question.
Yeah, another structural thing to point to here, The Australian had a piece about Project Peacock. So back in 2021, Singtel transferred about 100 of Optus's technical specialists to Indian tech giant Infosys as part of selling its IT service delivery business. These weren't just any employees, they were the technical backbone of the company. Of the 100 transferred, 22 of them are left now.
Yeah, so the critics there are saying it's been a really big brain drain for Optus, and it's left it vulnerable to these sort of technological errors and having catastrophic effects as a result. The federal government's now investigating. There's also an independent review that's being led by Dr. Kerry Schott. Critics, though, question how independent that can be because, of course, Optus has commissioned it, but she's known as being a pretty straight shooter. Singtel reps will be in Australia next week, and the Communications Minister, Annika Wells, would like a meeting with them.
I bet she would when she gets back from New York City.
Yep.
Moving on to why Tylenol was one of the most searched terms on Google this week. That happened after President Trump held this press conference on Monday where he warned pregnant women not to take Tylenol. It sort of seemed quite out of the blue to me. In Aussie terms, we're talking here about Panadol. We're not really familiar with Tylenol. It's used to treat fever, basically, and mild to moderate pain, and I think all parents are very familiar with Panadol for their kids.
I can imagine. It was one of those moments where I was a bit like, how did we get here? The context is that there was an announcement that Trump and the Trump administration were making around new initiatives from his sort of program to tackle autism. He described it as an epidemic in that press conference on Monday. He said that it's risen from about 1 in 150 kids in the year 2000 to 1 in 31 today.
Yeah, and Trump said paracetamol can be associated with a very increased risk of autism. He told pregnant women don't take Tylenol and to tough it out when it comes to fever and pain during pregnancy. His health secretary, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., was standing right there with him, and Trump said that they understand a lot more than a lot of people who studied autism.
Yeah, you can imagine the reaction to that from some very senior people in health in the United States. So the evidence that Trump was citing comes from a recent study that was authored by some very well-respected scientists. Harvard were involved, for example. What it found is an association between paracetamol use in pregnancy and neurodevelopment issues.
Yeah, it did find that, but the study specifically said that they couldn't prove causation, which is a whole other thing. There's also a major Swedish study from 2024 that looked at 2.5 million children, and while they initially found a small association between paracetamol use and autism, causation wasn't there.
No, so the experts say that might suggest some sort of genetic factors and not the medication itself. And the medical response to Trump's statement was pretty swift. The World Health Organization was one that put its hand up. It said that the claims were irresponsible. The American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists said that what he said was harmful and confusing.
Yeah, it's also interesting that the Food and Drug Administration in the US, which is part of Trump's own administration, issued a letter stating that a causal relationship hasn't been established and that it's an ongoing area of scientific debate. They advised using paracetamol at the lowest effective dose for the shortest time, which is actually what doctors already recommend.
Yeah, that's what they say about it all the time.
It's not just a daily thing you have with your breakfast.
No, exactly. So questions about what has been said here in Australia, because as we said, it's been one of the biggest search terms even here in Australia this week, Tylenol, to try and understand what this is. So our TGA, the Therapeutic Goods Administration, came out and said that paracetamol is considered safe. Jodie, some commentary too about Trump's language, talking about ending autism and telling women to tough it out when they're in pain.
Yeah, the bottom line is that untreated fever in pregnancy can cause real problems. I know I had influenza at one stage in one of my pregnancies and needed to take Panadol just to get the fever down. Those problems can include miscarriage and birth defects, so that has its own risks. And most experts agree that autism results from complex genetic and environmental factors, and you can't just point to one single cause.
To round us out this week, we thought we'd take a look at the Financial Review's annual power list. It dropped yesterday. No surprises there that Anthony Albanese holds on to the number one spot.
Bit of a given, really, particularly after that huge election win a few months back. The Fin says that he's the most powerful PM in 30 years, and they're calling his 28 new Labor MPs his Praetorian Guard. Basically, he can do whatever he wants in a legislative sense for the next 6 years, they say.
I had to do the maths in 30 years.
Same.
Does that count John Howard's term? Is he more powerful, do they think, than John Howard, for example, let alone Paul Keating and Bob Hawke?
Or do we just sort of forget about them a little bit?
Maybe we do, that's right. And look, that assessment essentially saying that he can do what he wants legislatively for the next 6 years, that's giving him another term. Like they're basically betting that he's going to win the next election as well. They reckon in that equation that he'll get that Senate on side. Of course, Labor doesn't control the Senate and can be quite tricky to actually getting your agenda up, but they're saying they reckon that he's going to get it done.
Yeah.
Treasurer Jim Chalmers jumps from the 5th spot last year to the 2nd spot as our second most powerful person in the country. It kind of makes sense. He's really positioning himself at the moment as this sort of architect of a new way of doing the economy.
Interesting. Foreign Minister Penny Wong stays steady at 3rd spot. She's juggling everything at the moment, from Trump's America to recognising Palestine, keeping both our US alliance and the left happy, which is is no easy feat. So if she's able to pull that off, then she deserves that spot.
Yeah, kudos to her. When it comes to covert power, so those behind the scenes, Paul Erickson, who's Labor's National Secretary, comes on top. They're calling him miraculous for the campaign that he ran that, of course, won so many new seats for Labor off such a low primary vote.
You forget that, don't you?
Yeah, so just to remember, Labor only won 33% of the primary vote, but they won that election in a landslide.
Yeah, when it comes to corporate power, Matt Common from CommBank takes the crown. He was the only CEO that was invited to both days of that economic reform roundtable that we talked about recently. Gina Reinhart also makes the corporate top 10. Apparently, she's more likely to be found at Mar-a-Lago with Trump than at Parliament House these days.
And for a bit of fun, the fabulous Lauren Sams, who we've had on the Squiz a couple of times, she's the fashion editor for the Financial Review. She pulled together a really fun list of power players that aren't people.
Like objects.
Like objects. And topping that list, the humble caramel slice.
I'd almost forgotten about this, but this was quite a moment this year that we've discussed before. That's, of course, about Nagi from Recipe Tin Eats accusing Brookie from Brookie's Bakehouse of plagiarising her caramel slice recipe. It's making me feel a bit hungry talking about it. I also saw that Labubu Dolls was on the list as well.
They were, and I couldn't think of a better way of explaining why we did Labubus as a Squiz shortcut this week, because they're totally a thing.
Great timing.
It's not just a trend. It's got a whole interesting bit of, China and business and
culture,
all that kind of stuff. So dive into that shortcut on the Squiz Today show if you want to get on top of that one.
We're well-rounded people here at the Squiz.
Exactly. What's coming up in the week ahead, starting with today? It's AFL Grand Final day. I don't need to tell a good slab of Australia that. That's on at the MCG. Geelong taking on Brisbane. Kicks off at 2:30 p.m.
Bring it on. The Lions are going for back-to-back premierships after beating Sydney last year. They've made 3 straight grand finals now, and they've actually beaten Geelong twice already this season in the home and away rounds.
But the Cats, Geelong, did get the better of them in the qualifying finals a couple of weeks ago. They won that game by 38 points. So this is Geelong's first grand final since they won it in 2022. They also beat Sydney. Remember, Sydney had that sort of made it to the top but didn't quite
finish
get the
it
crown.
Off.
Yeah. So Chris Scott, who is Geelong's coach, he's going for his 3rd premiership as coach. Snoop Dogg, he's doing the pre-game
pretty big attraction.
Along with Baker Boy, Tash Sultana and Vera Blue.
Yeah, should be a great day. 1 a.m. tomorrow morning Eastern Aussie time, the Women's Rugby World Cup final is on at Twickenham. That's Canada versus England. I feel like we've been on a bit of a journey with these ones, Claire, so it's important to bring it home. Canada stunned New Zealand 34-19 in the semi to make it into the final. The Black Ferns hadn't lost a World Cup knockout game since 1991. Huge.
Quite a boil over that one. So Canada, an interesting part of their story, they had to crowdfund to be able to get to the World Cup and do it so well. They raised nearly $1 million. So that was pretty cool. England, though, they're on a 32-match winning streak. They beat France in their semi-final. So, yeah, with that English crowd at Twickenham, it should be epic.
Great atmosphere. Also in London, PM Anthony Albanese is there this weekend to attend the Global Progress Action Summit that brings together key global figures from the political left. He will meet with UK PM Keir Starmer, Canada's Mark Carney and a host of leaders from Spain, Denmark, many of whom have been vocal critics of Trump's conservative and isolationist administration. Yep,
that'll be an interesting moment, of course, for our great friendship with America. They're going to be talking about AUKUS, so that's an interesting point too. Also climate targets, which you would expect. Albanese is going to speak with King Charles as well before he heads to Liverpool to give an address at the Labor Party conference. It's pretty common now for Australia's Labor leaders to go to that conference and address it.
Yeah, back on home soil on Monday, it's a public holiday for the King's birthday in WA. School holidays kick off in the ACT and New South Wales.
You know that all too well.
I know that too well. One of them's already on holidays. And Monday and Tuesday, the Reserve Bank Board is meeting with the interest rate decision coming down at 2:30 p.m. Tuesday afternoon.
Yeah, so consensus is that they're going to hold steady on interest rates this time around. I mean, that's up to the Reserve Bank board, but certainly when it comes to economists, most of them seem to think that's going to be the result, particularly with headline inflation creeping back up to 3% in August. We learned that result this week. Back to Monday just briefly, the Prime Minister's Literary Awards are announced. It's the richest literary prize in the nation. It's got a prize pool of $600,000, which isn't anything to sneeze at.
Yeah.
Tim Winton's Juice is on the shortlist.
It's been a few years since I've read a Tim Winton book, so maybe I need to check out Juice.
That on, could be on your Christmas list.
Yeah, it could be on my reco list.
Yeah.
I'll let you know. Tuesday, Melbourne Fringe Festival kicks off. That's running until the 19th of October. It'll cover everything from a cabaret about your cat's dinner, Claire, to tango. Like to mix it up. Wednesday is the Dally M Medal, Rugby League's Night of Nights. For the men, Warriors halfback Luke Metcalf, James Tedesco from the Roosters and Terrell May from the Tigers are all being talked about as potential winners for the season's best and fairest.
There you go. For the women, Isabel Kelly from the Roosters looks to have it wrapped up. And if she does win that, she'll be the third Rooster in 4 years to take that out. So there's clearly something happening that's really wonderful for women at that club. Also on Wednesday, Australia takes on New Zealand in the Women's Cricket World Cup. That's at 7:30 p.m. our time. The timing's pretty good for us Aussies to be able to watch these matches.
Unlike the 1 a.m. rugby games,
Exactly.
You can watch that cricket free on Prime Video. They've actually put the whole tournament outside their paywall, which is nice. Australia are defending champions. They've won it 7 times. Captain Alyssa Healy is back from injury and Sophie Molyneux has recovered from her knee surgery.
They're going in with some pretty good form, so fingers crossed for them. Wednesday is also when they crown the champion, Jody, of Fat Bear Week.
Been hearing a lot about Fat Bear Week, so I'll have to be watching.
We're not going to linger on that this week. We will get to the result next week, no doubt. That, of course, is all happening in Alaska's Katmai National Park. You can check that out online over the weekend for sure.
Nice scenery too.
Oh, it's beautiful. So much fun.
Also on Wednesday, Blaise Metrawelli becomes the UK's first female boss of MI6 in the Intelligence Service's 116-year history. That's a big move. She's currently their Director of Technology and Innovation, basically the real-world Q.
Yeah, quite an amazing rise for her. Thursday, Yom Kippur begins at sundown. That's the Day of Atonement. It's the holiest day of the Jewish calendar. Friday, Diddy's sentencing in New York. He was found guilty, of course, in July. We talked about it at the time. That was on 2 counts of transportation to engage in prostitution. He's facing a maximum of 20 years in prison, but his lawyers are asking for 14 months plus some supervised release with some mandatory drug treatment and counselling.
His friends and family submitted over 70 letters asking for leniency for him, saying that he's not doing well in prison. It's going to be closely watched to see where the judge lands on this. If they go too easy, of course, they're accused of going easy on the celebrity.
Yeah.
Also on Friday, no sooner is the AFL over than the draft process begins. No rest for the wicked. 64 players have been invited for physical assessments and interviews in the lead up to the actual draft later in the year.
Yep, the cycle continues.
Sure does.
Squiz Recommends, Jody. I missed this episode of Australian Story last week. So it's not this week's episode, it's last week's episode, but I caught up on it on iView. Their episode with Kate Reid, who is the founder of Loon, which is a croissanterie.
You make me hungry again.
I know, sorry. Caramel
and it's
slice.
The croissanterie, right?
It's the croissanterie. The episode's called All Consuming. Kate Reid is a fascinating woman. She has this obsessive streak. So whatever she does with absolute commitment. She became an engineer and worked in F1. She was the first woman in one of those big teams. It didn't pan out for her. She didn't enjoy the experience. She then was battling with anorexia, again, part of this sort of obsessive control.
Perfectionist personality, yeah.
And she came home from the UK to Australia and got focused on baking. She wanted to be be the best baker she possibly could be and discovered French pastry. It's a fascinating episode. She brought that scientific engineering kind of background to making the perfect croissant, and it's been recognised around the world as one of the best examples of that pastry.
Yeah, people queue for ages to get those. I've read a profile on her before and also found her so interesting. So I look forward to seeing it brought to life. Australian Story always does a good job of that. I was going to recommend a show that I have been watching this year, but I've decided it's not up to scratch for Squizzes. So I'm going back to an old favourite.
We don't want to know about that.
We don't want mediocre recommendations. So I'm going to recommend a show that's still on Netflix. It's called 3 Identical Strangers. And if you love a doco like me, and if you're fascinated by that sort of nature versus nurture debate, human behaviour, psychology, it's one for you. It's about these 3 identical triplets in the States who were separated at birth, adopted out to different families. Even the families from memory didn't know that these kids they got were one of a set of triplets, but they discovered each other. It's already an interesting story, but the way that this doco takes it, what happens in their lives and the influence that their families and upbringings have had is fascinating. So
it's like a very unfortunate social experiment.
Exactly, like an unintended social experiment, because often with those nature versus nurture experiments, they need to use twins who've been separated. Yeah. So this one, no one was actually studying them officially, but it's a cracker.
Yeah, fantastic. We'll put the links to those into the episode notes, and 2 great sort of documentary type things to dive into when you've had enough football.
After the grand final.
for the weekend. That about wraps us up today. Have a good weekend.
You too, Claire. See you next week.